Good morning and welcome to Crabtree Church Sunday Sermon. Some 30 years ago I was dating a girl called Sarah. We'd been going out for about 3 months and were getting on fine. The path was upwards, but we'd not yet said those 3 magic words to each other. You know the ones, when someone in the couple takes the brave step of being the first to say, "I love you." Well, we were sitting on the sofa in a house watching a film and Sarah says out of the blue, "I love you." For a split second I thought she'd said, "I love you." But she completed the sentence with, "Your boots. I love your boots," is what she said to me. My boots were on my feet and they were stretched out in front of me. I was sat legs crossed and the boots were displayed in all their glory. So I felt justified in my fashion sense, but strangely deflated in my personal romance stakes. So close. The subject this morning is love. And the passage that we read at church, and if you haven't read it, it's from 1 Corinthians 13. It's a favourite at weddings. It's read during the wedding service. Then the minister gives a wedding address to the newly married couple on the nature of love, and he uses this passage as a basis for a long and happy marriage. 1 Corinthians 13 is used so often at weddings that we tend to overlook the original context by the Apostle Paul. 1 Corinthians 13 comes in a section written to the church in Corinth on how to get along with one another in daily church life. You're all part of the body of Christ. This is how you are to behave in worship, during communion, with your spiritual gifts. So the context is life among the church. And in order for you to function well, it is love that you should strive for. These are the words which Paul states in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 1. You should strive for love. Well, over the years, the passage has been applied to marriage. Now, that's fine. But today, we're going to remember and apply the passage to life in the local church, which means this is how I should treat the other members of Crabtree Church. The key words about love are found in the middle of the passage. Look at verse 4. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. You should read these words and then apply them to yourself. And if you're honest about it, realize where you are weak and need improvement in your loving other members of the church. Well, it's one thing to tell you about it, and it's another to do it. Let me ask you a question. What are the 2 greatest commandments? Jesus was asked what is the greatest commandment, and he replied in Matthew 22, beginning at verse 37, Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." We often think of these 2 commandments as coming in order of importance. Love God comes first because he is God. And love neighbor comes second because to love our neighbor first is to put our neighbor above God, and that's idolatry. So we need to get the order right. But they come in this order for another reason. If you do not love God first and foremost, you will not be able to love your neighbor properly. If you do not love God and seek your fullest satisfaction in him, you will be poorly equipped to love your neighbor. Loving God, seeking him, pursuing him is the prerequisite for living out 1 Corinthians 13. If you do not love God first, then when it comes to your neighbor, you will not be kind, nor patient, nor trusting, nor delighting in truth, nor persevering. If you do not love God first, you will be easily angered. You will keep a record of wrongs. You will be proud, boastful, jealous, self-centered. So loving people is not possible if you're not pursuing God above all that the devil offers you in sinful allurements and attractions, and above all God's precious gifts. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 10, verse 37. Jesus said this, "He who loves mother or father more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves brother or sister more than me is not worthy of me. Or who loves husband or wife more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves social justice more than me is not worthy of me. Or job, or loves clothes, or fashion, or sports, toys. You can insert your own word. If you love any of these things more than Jesus, you are not worthy of him. So in our affections, we must love God first. You can't love people unless you love God first. If you don't know the love of God, if you're not pursuing the love of God, how can you draw others in? If you don't have it, you can't give it. And simply this, you will not have the resources to take the hits, the pains, and the losses to love people this way. Because people are not perfect. People are different to you. They don't think the way you do. Their personality is different. They react differently. Their values are different. They look different. They speak different. And that's just St Albans. But I'm talking about here in Harpenden, in the same town as we are in, here in Crabtree Church. If you don't love God and pursue him, how will you be able to love your neighbour? How will you keep no record of wrongs? How will you persevere? How will you trust? How will you rejoice in truth? The only way you get past the baggage that you carry and others carry is found in the presence of God. And I'm telling you this from personal experience, but I'm going to show it to you from the Bible too. Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and we're going to look at verses 1 and 2. 2 Corinthians 8, verses 1 and 2. Paul writes and says, "And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity." The background is this. The churches in Macedonia are at Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea. Paul founded these on his second missionary journey. You can read about it in Acts 16-17. Paul's now back in Macedonia. He's writing to the church in Corinth, and he's using the Macedonians as an example to stir up the Corinthians to love. So the Macedonian churches are the example for the church in Corinth to follow. What happened in Macedonia? Grace showed up in Macedonia. Grace showed up in the churches at Macedonia. 2 Corinthians 8 verse 1. The grace of God appeared and was showered upon the people there. God's grace came down from heaven and brought salvation to the people in Macedonia. And how did they respond? Look at verse 2. The response to God's grace among them was an abundance of joy. Their joy was overflowing. Why so joyful? Were their lives full of material blessings and peace? No. Look at verse 2. They were living in extreme poverty and in the midst of a very severe trial. Grace had come down from heaven, and it produced in the people an abundance of joy in the middle of their affliction and poverty. So this isn't prosperity gospel. The first response to God's grace was not poverty and affliction disappearing, but joy exploding in the hearts of the people who received it. Joy in the grace of God and what it produces. Paul was collecting money from the churches in Greece to send back to the church in Jerusalem, which was undergoing a severe trial. So what happened when Paul asked the people in Macedonia for help? Out of an abundance of joy and the grace of God given to them, it led to an overflow and a wealth of generosity. Could they afford it? No. They had their own affliction and their own poverty, but they gave generously anyway. So when you can say that God is everything to me, there comes an abundance of joy. The Macedonians were extremely poor, but they gave anyway, and they gave generously. And out of this we find we have a definition of love. In a severe test of affliction, an abundance of joy, despite extreme poverty, overflowed in generosity. Look down at verse 8 in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul calls this act of generosity love. Paul writes to the church in Corinth and says to them basically, prove that you can love like the church in Macedonia loves. So from this we get a definition of love. Love is defined as the overflow of joy in God which meets the needs of others. Love is the overflow of joy in God which meets the needs of others. Love is the God-given, grace-enabled impulse to expand your joy in God by including others and drawing them into it. In this case, in Macedonia, extending resources even though they were poor. You cannot love others fully without first entering into a loving relationship with God. My second proof comes from Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. And the writer says this to the Hebrew Christians. Remember those early days after you had received the light, when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. Roman prisons were not like our prisons. You didn't get medical help. You were lucky to get food. You didn't get given clothing if you needed it. To survive in prison, you needed people to visit and bring you supplies. Christians were imprisoned for their faith, their property confiscated, insulted, persecuted. But if you visited someone in prison, you ran the risk of being identified as a Christian with them. If you stood side by side with those already being persecuted, you ran the risk of receiving the same treatment, same insults, property taken, even prison yourself. And many of you will know what it can be like. You stick up for the underdog and the bullies turn on you as well. So what were these Hebrew Christians doing? They went to visit those in prison. They identified with them. They stood side by side, even if it meant their own imprisonment. And how do they feel about this? They joyfully accepted the plundering of their property. I mean, how can you be so upside down in your thinking? Do you rejoice when people steal your property, your house, or your car gets stolen? How do you respond? I had a car stolen twice when I lived in Oxford, and to be honest, I was angry both times. But these Hebrews identified with the person in prison and they took hits for it, and those hits made them glad. How do you become that sort of person? How do you love others like that, sacrificing for them to your own personal cost? How do you seek the benefit of others above your own welfare? Verse 34, since you knew yourselves that you had a better and lasting possession. It's because they had something better than all the property in the world. They had something better and something abiding that's present and with them, which lasted. Present with them, which people couldn't steal, which couldn't be confiscated. They'd received the light of the gospel of Jesus. They'd received the eternal presence of God. And the reason these Hebrew Christians rejoiced and loved is because they knew in the depths of their being they had something better and lasting. You cannot love others without first pursuing God yourself. And so the nature of love is this: people are loved by you, but at any cost to yourself, including your life, you seek to expand your joy in God by bringing them into it. You will give yourself to expanding your joy in God by including others in it. You'll lay down your life to include others in your enjoyment of God. I mean, isn't this what Jesus did on the cross? He laid down his life to bring us into relationship with God, with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. So if you do not abide in the love of God, if you do not live in the grace of God, if you are not actively pursuing a relationship with God, then living out 1 Corinthians 13 is impossible. And it will show up in your behavior. You won't be able to hide it. I'm going to tell you two personal stories now. When I was 30, I got engaged to a girl called Helen. Helen was a Christian, very attractive, pretty, vivacious, the sort of girl who would light up a room when she walked into it. and we dated for a year. We were serious. I proposed. She said yes. And I took Helen to meet my friends and family, and we started trying to plan a wedding. But we argued. We argued often in relationship. And the more we tried to plan a wedding, the more we argued and the deeper the arguments got. And to cut a long story short, things got so bad, I prayed about the relationship and felt the Lord say, no, she's not the one for you. Now, God doesn't always give me that clear guidance from relationships, but in this case he did. I called it off, we broke up, and Helen was out of my life. Afterwards, a few of my close friends told me, in hindsight, well, not in hindsight, they knew, but I was too blind to see, that Helen was self-centered. She may have been a Christian, but she was extremely self-seeking. And in hindsight, for me, there was little evidence of her loving the Lord and that love flowing out into her relationships. Almost 10 years later, I met Maureen. And Maureen was also attractive, intelligent, not as extrovert as Helen. But what I noticed about Maureen, and I noticed this straight away, was the way she loved God. In everything she did, Maureen loved God. And out of that love for God, I could see flowing a selfless heart, a generous heart, a giving heart. And to be quite frank, a heart much better than my own. Maureen was no pushover. She would stand for truth and would fight for truth. But it was the way she fought for what was right which won you over. It's won me over. When you're up close to someone, you see what motivates them. And if you're up close to them for a long time, you really see what motivates them. And being married to Maureen, I was up close. And I could see what motivated her the most. It was her love for God, which helped her live out 1 Corinthians 13. If you want to love one another, it starts with loving the Lord your God. For out of the abundance of joy you receive, you will be equipped to live out 1 Corinthians 13. Amen. God bless you, and I'll see you next week when we'll expand and look deeper into this passage.